And good evening and welcome to City Focus. I'm Marty Olsen, your host, and tonight I'm delighted to welcome back to the program. He's been on a handful of times, my friend Hayward Gatch. Welcome.
Great to be here yet again.
Yes. And folks, please don't get nervous if you see some like red splotches on my face. I'm dealing with skin cancer, and I've got this ointment treatment which burns the hell out of the cells, the cancer cells, but it apparently burns everything else around it. So it will go away. So that's what's going on. So I'm opening up to you and let you know what's going on with me. And before we get into our discussion, I just have a couple of quick public service announcements I'd like to make. One is the New London Republicans will be hosting their first annual Lincoln Day barbecue bash, and that's a week from tonight at where's that? The Barn at Fort Hill Road in Groton from 6 to 9 p.m. Music from Bootleg Harmony. It's $50 per person. Mike France is anticipated to be there, and I won't say he's got a keynote speech, but he will certainly be addressing the crowd, and we're expecting some other dignitaries and elected officials there as well. So it'll be a good opportunity to meet some folks and schmooze and have a good time. Also, I'd like to, and I'll be doing this regularly, remind everybody about the upcoming Kiwanis Club annual golf tournament, which is in September on the 15th at Shinnecossett in Groton. And as per always, we need golfers and we need sponsors, we need prizes and volunteers, all the components to make a successful golf tournament. And the last few years, we've really done a great job. And I might add that all of the money goes back into the community. There are no administrative expenses. So when you contribute to the New London Kiwanis Club, you know that you're supporting your local community. And you and I participated last Friday evening in a fundraiser that was hosted by local radio celebrity Lee Elsey, and 94.9 FM on your radio dial, full power radio. Pinsanity it was called.
Yeah, aptly named, really. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. A really great opportunity to not only support a lot of local charities, but to meet people from the radio. Meet people that have only ever heard me or you over audio, or maybe in your case through video. To actually see them in person, have a real one-to-one conversation is great. I had a positively abominable performance with bowling, as I was expected to. That was my 4th time bowling ever. And I did not do well. Of course, I was pitted against the now legendary Mike France in the first heat.
Well, didn't Mr. France, he ended up winning the entire tournament.
He took the whole competition, so I never stood a chance. Not that I would have against anyone, frankly.
Well, but it was a random drawing. I mean, you could have been drawing me and you could have won.
I don't think I would have, to be honest with you. Especially considering, this speaks to my inexperience, when I was throwing the balls, my knuckles were snagging on the holes in the ball and kind of leading to a random trajectory for about the first half of the game. And then I realized, oh, some balls have bigger holes. So while I'm under no illusions I would have gotten out of the heat anyways, perhaps my score might have been a bit better.
Well, as long as I think everybody, I think, had fun.
Yeah.
There was certainly a lot of fellowship and camaraderie, and good conversation and schmoozing. And there was a lot of good people, regular guests on the program.
Absolutely.
I thought Lee did a terrific job moving along. I mean, there's just one situation where one of the participants got hurt.
Yeah, and even he managed to have fun.
and that was unfortunate, but I think that all the money went back into the primarily local community and local charities.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think when it was all said and done, they netted over $20,000.
They did, yeah. And that was a mixture of selling items that were generously donated from local businesses, as well as a GoFundMe that people were donating in to build up this pool of money. So bowlers had to donate a minimum of $100 to get in, which, for most people is fairly achievable. And then they got a chance to bowl. But people that maybe didn't want to bowl still have the opportunity to donate. My mother, for example, donated $50. I donated $100 because I got in for the competition itself when slots were still open. But that model, I think, has a lot of potential for future events. And I'm sure Lee will do this again because he has this tendency to want to help out the community. And that's something that we all share. I mean, of course, you have your Kiwanis Club event, too, an event that you can rely on our sponsorship yet again this year. So, yeah, I mean, helping out the community is very important.
Yeah, I think, those who have the capacity to give back, it's critical to give back.
Oh, absolutely.
To have a vibrant, viable community, you have to have people who are giving back, whether it be through time or money or both, and whatever they're able to do. And there's so many ways to give back. I mean, and there's so many different needs. It could be anything from coaching and scouts to food, food insecurity.
Absolutely.
I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, and if we can,
loneliness with the elderly, people who are shut-ins, transportation.
Yeah, and if we can normalize that culture of giving, that culture of compassion, I think we could have a much better world, one that I'd much rather have my children grow up in.
Yeah, well, I would agree.
Yeah.
And, with what's going on internationally, it's a little bit scary that some of this stuff, I hate to see this house of cards come tumbling down.
Yeah, and it's tough for me to imagine a complete tumbling, but certainly something of a crumbling is already well underway. And when that crumbling might slow, who knows? So, I've long been of the opinion that many dynamics within our both national and global society are not really sustainable in the long term. So we've always had the attitude where we should take whatever advantages we have and invest those into our independence from this system. Naturally, given my political persuasions, I have certain objections to the system entirely, so I wanted to avoid the certain hypocrisy one might have in saying, well, I don't like this system, but I need it to survive. I don't much care for it, so I'd rather get away from it at all possible. So we do a lot with home cultivation of food. We do a lot with building networks of support between our friends and family, trying to create a separate infrastructure, because this infrastructure seems in more ways than one to be not doing so well. So to me, the large systems are not necessarily a reliable source of stability. And if they aren't, what's the next step? To me, the next step is to turn locally, to see our friends and our neighbors as the mutual resources that we are for each other.
Yeah. Well, in that vein, one thing I wanted to address with you this evening is you've had a keen interest in Fort Trumbull in London. Yeah. Enough so that you folks and folks that you're associated with planted a bit of a garden, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure what the status of that is at the moment, and I have not been down there recently, but you've led me to believe in conversations that you do go through there periodically. And maybe you can share some of the goings-on in Fort Trumbull.
So my last time there was a couple weeks ago at this point. So maybe things have changed, but given the nature of Fort Trumbull projects, maybe they haven't. So I'll have to go back and see what's actually happening there to give you a truly up-to-date response. With that said, the orchard property, the primary site of it, we do have stuff all over the city, actually, including several other sites within Fort Trumbull itself. But the primary lot location that most people are familiar with has been bulldozed. With that said, depending on what they're going to do with it, the trees are gone, but a lot of the ground vegetables that exist there, some of them, the more you bulldoze them, the more they grow. So we'll see what happens there. Certain things like they call the Jerusalem artichoke or the sunchoke, it's one of those things where you till it around and bust it up and you just get more plants, and they're all edible. So in the event that this project is abandoned, as so many of them are, you better believe we'll have seeds in hand, ready to go. Because we believe it's important to utilize vacant or abandoned space to reduce human suffering however possible. Naturally, as you know, my relationship with the law is a somewhat flexible one. Not necessarily just for the goal of defying the law, but to say what is the better situation here? To me, an abandoned space is an opportunity to reduce human suffering. And we take a calculated risk, of course. Stepping outside of the law to do that means that any day, a few months ago, it can get destroyed. That can happen. But it's a bet. So in the event it doesn't get destroyed, what's the payoff? The payoff is an enormous productive ecosystem that people can utilize for their benefit. So if it gets destroyed, so be it. If it doesn't, then we've created something beautiful. And that's something we're doing all over the place because it's a project that we believe in. I was on Lee's show for almost a half an hour recently talking about the value, not only on an individual but a community level, in a relationship with the bounty of nature. We are so fortunate to have a planet and a biosphere that is just bristling with life, and life that we can enter into a relationship with and have a better situation. You see, a lot of my food comes from my yard. My food doesn't so much come from a grocery store, a corporation, a government. So if I decide I don't like the grocery store's prices or the government's rules or something, I can go into my yard and get my food. That creates a more independent person that is able to have a more consensual relationship with the entities around them.
And you're able to produce enough food on your property to sustain yourself and your family.
More every year. And so now we're getting to the point where we have enough that we can start to give away those plants that we've propagated clones of to our neighbors, to our friends, to people in the community, because we want to generalize this understanding and this relationship with the natural world. So, for example, people think of the kiwi as a strictly tropical plant. There is a Siberian variety that actually grows in this climate. They're a little bit smaller, they don't have the fuzz on them, but they are very much kiwis. And what happens when you take a vine and put it in the ground and bury it is that sprouts roots. Once those roots are sprouted, I clip the vine from the mother plant and I hand that to a friend. Here's a kiwi plant. It cost me nothing to produce, and now it's yours. And now it can produce you God knows how much bounty just by this little act of non-commodified interaction. And many plants are this way. So a few years ago, we distributed dozens of basil plants, which, you can't live off of basil, but it makes your food taste nice if you're so inclined, by just clipping the tops off of a basil plant and putting them in water. A few weeks later, roots. Put them in the ground, new basil plant. These types of things are things that everyone used to know, but we're so involved with our phones, among other things, that we've forgotten these types of relationships that we can have.
Now, do you in your family, do you eat any meat products? I mean, beef or chicken or
we do.
Fish?
I'm not a fish person, but fish is consumed in my family. And long term, we do have an interest in exploring some sort of relationship with animal agriculture on our property, not only because it allows us to separate ourselves from the cost and potential chemical pollutants that exist within mainstream available products, but also there's a certain ethical entanglement. Some people might feel a certain comfort that this animal was treated in such a way that is more consistent with our values versus a mass factory farming situation. Some people feel that maybe the animals deserve better in those situations. And if you can distance yourself from those things that you don't like, you can lead a more intellectually and ethically consistent life, and also model a different way of things happening. We've all seen how chicken plants recently catching on fire, prices change. Well, I have plenty of chickens in my yard, and I don't anticipate them catching on fire anytime soon. I've insulated myself from those extraneous variables. For the most part, those chickens for me are good for eggs, and they last for quite some time. So, maybe long term we decide those chickens end up being harvested for meat of some kind. But for the time being, they're better just producing eggs every day.
That's fascinating. And how large of a lot are we working?
So the actual lot that we work with is under an acre. I have over 34 acres of property that I call my home, but most of it is wild forest. And what we're trying to do in that forest is cultivate what's called a forest garden. Now this is similar to what we were trying to do at Fort Trumbull, where you have layers of plants in a forest to create an abundant space without necessarily having the conventionally understood monoculture field of just one crop, because there's a certain ecological consequence with having a monoculture. You have to artificially inflate the soil fertility. You have to treat it for all sorts of chemicals and bugs to make sure it works, because it's not a naturally occurring plant. So what we can do is you work with how plants operate symbiotically, how species operate symbiotically, how different layers of plant strata can create different microclimates for different plants. It's agriculture versus what's called permaculture. And permaculture emphasizes an understanding of those natural rhythms and working with them rather than fighting against them. There's a certain arrogance that we have in, especially in Western culture around the time of colonialization, where we said, you have this big wild forest, we need to chop it down, build houses, build masts for the Royal Navy, and plant, wheat, corn, whatever. But there are other ways to cultivate things, and some of those ways are significantly less maintenance and input, because you're working with those natural rhythms rather than fighting tooth and nail to maintain your tightly controlled plot. So think about something like the American groundnut, for example. I talked about this on Lee's show. You can kind of think of it as a cousin of a peanut. There are still groves of it that were planted by the natives that are growing to this day that have survived the denuding of New England. And those things were put there by people hundreds of years ago. And because they were put in a space where they were able to thrive, they're still thriving to this day. It's almost as if a relationship with plants is something like magic, but it's real. And for those who are inclined to a belief in a creationist perspective, that is a profoundly valuable gift from the Creator that I think should be valued. And a lot of people don't.
Well, you're doing your small part, at least within your family unit.
Absolutely.
And is this property? Do you own this, or do you rent?
Yeah, this is family land. So we came to the conclusion that if we all pooled our resources and operated cooperatively, we could have more together than we ever would have individually. So there's several houses on the property owned by several members of my family. So we all have our own little spot. And this is a big part of what I believe is an approach to a society. I like the idea of having my mother and my mother-in-law and my wife and eventually possibly my brother all on this property operating cooperatively, because for the vast majority of human history, that's how we did things. We had closely knit families operating cooperatively, several generations in the same household providing support for each other, being stronger together than they would be individually. That's how most of the world operates. And we have this idea in modern society that we need to all be atomized and separate. And I think that on the whole tends to make folks more disconnected. And, maybe you are less bothered by the disconnection because, again, you have your fancy shiny box to look into. But you're missing out on something. There's an importance to humanity and connection. That's a big part of our nature as a species. Even just look at the disappearance of the front porch in house design over the years. People don't have that anymore. And I think we need to claw that back, because the connection you can have with your community will always be better than the connection with watching football. I'm sorry to say, but it's something I firmly believe.
Well, your lifestyle is certainly fascinating. It's different. But as you have noted, I mean, there's a plan. There's a template for this. This is not you're not necessarily breaking new ground.
No, not at all. And that's what makes
you're recreating the past.
I'm recreating something that I feel is more conducive to human happiness and well-being. I was very fortunate to have a lot of good breaks in life, and I used that to the best of my ability to not only create a situation where myself and my children could live happily, but also to try to find a way to broaden that bounty. I'm not the kind of person that will be given a good break in life and just hold myself up in a gilded cage. I'm the kind of person that says, okay, I've been given a break here. How do I bring this to other people? How do I bring other people along? Because I happen to believe that I'm no more valuable or special than anyone else. The person that is living outside, just outside the building somewhere is worth every bit as much as I am. And so I happen to believe that person would benefit from a better life. And if I can do something about that, I'm going to do that. And that's why I do so much of the community aid work. I'm a firm believer in the saying that if you have more than you need, you should build a longer table and not a higher wall. And that's something I enact in my own life. It's not just something I say. You know, some people will say lots of flowery language. Many of our liberal friends may just talk a big game, especially when it's with other people's resources. But I do it with my own because I believe in enacting my values.
So if somebody shows up at your door and knocks on and says, I'm hungry, you'll feed them.
Yeah. You know, and there was
or needs a place to rest their head for a night.
We can and have done that on many occasions. We've provided shelter for a lot of friends over the years that have fallen on hard times because those things happen. And, you know, there's a certain historical example of a certain somebody who's actually had quite an impact on our society that talked about the importance of kindness and loving thy neighbor. And I happen to think that that's very important and a good lesson to follow. And naturally, there are variables in the world that would give a person caution around certain social interactions. You know, the truth is always in nuance. You need to use your head, of course. But I think it's always important to lead with the attempt and the good faith to try to do what you can to help your neighbor and love your neighbor as best as you can. So even an instance where, for example, my neighbor thought that someone was wandering around his yard late at night, I went right outside and went to look through the woods to help him, to make sure his space was safe. Turns out he saw someone's headlights that shine strangely through the forest in such a way, so it was a false alarm. But, you know, that sort of being there for your neighbor at the drop of a hat, sometimes your literal neighbor, and sometimes your more figurative neighbor, I think is very important. So, you know, I've had instances where family friends had to leave a situation that they found was very dangerous, and we did whatever we could to accommodate them and give them a space to exist while they were planning their next move. And that's something we as humans have done for most of our history, but it's not so much done anymore because everyone's just so busy all the time, and everyone's so atomized and so suspicious. And how do we try to reverse that trend? Because from my perspective, continuing down that trend doesn't bring us happiness. It brings us a more separated world. And, you know, from a more libertarian perspective, it brings us a world where we're more divided and more easily conquered.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to assume anything.
Of course.
But you're married.
I am.
And you have children.
Yes, 2.
2. How old are your children?
My youngest is 2, and my eldest will be 4 very soon.
All right. I'm based on this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I would assume that your wife subscribes to this type of lifestyle that you're outlining here for your family.
More or less, yes.
Well, I think it's important. I mean,
absolutely.
And how do you anticipate when your children reach school age?
Yeah.
And your oldest is roughly a year.
Yeah.
Will you put your children into the public schools, or will you homeschool?
Well,
or look at some other alternative?
Yeah. So our plan for the moment is to do a little bit of homeschooling. And that's for a number of reasons. You know, naturally, through my various appearances on this show and Lee's show, it's no secret that I'm a bit of a radical politically. And I happen to see a lot of schooling as cultural conditioning, you know, sort of raising the citizens of tomorrow. And, you know, the citizens of tomorrow might be very nice people, but it's the government-approved version of the citizen of tomorrow. And perhaps that's not quite so consistent with my values. Now, obviously, there's a certain ethical entanglement of me saying I don't want my children indoctrinated by a system, so I go indoctrinate them with my own thing. Obviously, there's a dynamic of consent there, so I think it's important to eventually put them in a situation where they are engaging with the public, where they are able to see both sides of the story. I happen to think, and maybe this is a personal bias, that they're my children, so I'm going to raise them in a way that is consistent with my values and then expose them to the world to make their own decisions and live whatever life they find appropriate for them. But also critically, especially in light of recent events, I'm somewhat uncomfortable with my children going to school until they learn effectively how to duck and hide. You know, kindergartners, as we've seen quite recently, maybe don't have the situational awareness necessary to flee and conceal themselves in times of serious danger. And luckily in this situation recently, at least relatively luckily speaking, the police response was quick and the massacre was contained. Uvalde, for example, not so much. And you don't know how that's going to go until it happens. And if I'm going to allow my children to go into a space to be with the public, because I think that's important. I think, sheltering yourself and never becoming part of the public is a way to become irrelevant and not well-rounded.
Yeah, well, I mean,
but there's a danger.
Part of the educational experience should be, learning social skills.
Absolutely.
And getting along with other people.
Absolutely.
And not necessarily people that you agree with.
Of course. Yeah. And I have
be able to share the same space.
And there'll be a lot of that, I'm sure. Yeah, and that's why I want to put them in eventually. I want them to have that experience of diverse perspectives. I think that's very important. The whole reason I'm on more right-leaning talk radio all the time is because I believe it's important to mix perspectives and talk with each other, because I think if we insulate ourselves, it undermines that community that I'm going for. I think it's okay to disagree with people, especially when we talk about the founding of this country. Who disagreed with each other is the founders, and they still managed to create something incredible. So I want my children to have an experience with mainstream society, with school, but especially on the security angle, I want them to be more aware of their surroundings before I put them into that situation, because I have a very hard time trusting other people with the safety of my children. So before they are able to take responsibility for their own safety, of course, within reasonable ability, I'm somewhat uncomfortable with releasing them in that way. Because once that situation starts happening, you don't know how fast the response is going to be. You don't know where the disaster is going to start.
No, but you seem to be alluding to primarily physical safety, and there's also the intellectual
certainly
safety
that too.
As well, in terms of what the public schools are teaching.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier, I mean, your values. I mean, are they teaching values that are even close to your own? And are you going to be finding yourself competing with what's going on at home with what is going on in a public school?
I think just about everyone does. And I think being positioned adversarially to mainstream society, I'm always going to be in that conflict. And I think my children always will be in some way or another as well. And where they fall within the space of that dispute, at the end of the day, is up to them. I think I have a moral responsibility to expose them to multiple sides of the story. Obviously, I think I'm correct, but I could be wrong. Or maybe my values might not fit their priorities. I'm a firm believer that multiple answers to a problem might be possible. So like someone from my perspective might solve a hunger or something in some way, and someone in your perspective might solve it a different way. Does that mean either of us are wrong? No, not necessarily. We just have a different approach based on our values, our perspectives, our priorities. So I think it's important to allow people the autonomy to explore what fits best for them, because if I create a hegemonic ideological environment for my children, in some ways I'm no better than they are. So it's difficult, naturally, if you have a perspective that differs from the norm, with how to engage with that, because I happen to believe there's a lot very wrong with mainstream society. I happen to believe there's a lot very wrong with how children are educated or miseducated, in my personal opinion. But part of that is social skills. Part of that is engaging with the public. And at the end of the day, I think if I give them enough of the tools to learn how to think critically, to question what they're being taught and figure out what they believe to be true, I think that's a bit of a ideological inoculation to some of the more egregious things that are taught in the mainstream setting. Naturally, I view schools as something of a citizen factory. To me, I said this on Lee's show, it should be a place to learn, but in many ways it's where you go to learn your place. And that's not my favorite thing in the world. I think people should be allowed to maximize their full potential. And I was a person who was very much hampered by my education in school. So a lot of classes were not available to me because they weren't put out there. So when I went into school, I was the person who never paid attention, got very good grades, and by extension, never learned to try all that hard. And so when it came time to actual challenging things that were finally catching up to my academic abilities, I didn't even know how to try, and I had to learn this whole new thing, right?
Well, I mean, but that's, I think, one of the critical areas of education is the challenge.
Exactly, and that doesn't happen for a lot of people.
Well, how does that happen? But in the current environment, it seems like it's being, discouraged wholesale.
Yeah.
Where if you do challenge, I mean, then you're going to get kind of rubbed out.
Yeah, and
and that to me is appalling.
Yeah.
To be polite on public television.
Yeah, I would have perhaps equally colorful words as well, but since we're on television, I'll say this. When I was much younger, I felt this frustration very acutely of being in a class where I did not feel challenged, and to me it was frustrating and boring. And a bored child is a dangerous child. But when you don't get challenged, it's like exercising a muscle. So once you start to actually get challenged, you don't even necessarily know how to approach it. There's a concept called gifted kid burnout syndrome, where like a lot of kids were doing very well in school when they were younger, but were never pushed to apply themselves. And when it came time to do it, they end up falling off and never reaching their full potential. And if you don't then take it upon yourself to challenge yourself and learn, a lot of folks fall through the cracks, and that's a loss, because those are people that could do God knows how much for our society. And when I was a kid, I was pushing very hard against the elimination of honors and advanced placement classes because I thought it was important to push kids as far as they could. I was in the Westerly public school systems, and they had the gall to have a slogan where learning has no limits. And I felt my learning was extremely limited in that I would go to these classes and just feel completely unstimulated. And I am the kind of person that was very fortunate to have a certain thirst for knowledge, so I was doing it on my own. But if I weren't that kind of person, or maybe I had some other distractions in my life, God knows where I could have ended up. And who knows how many people ended up that way. Think about how many Einsteins, how many Teslas, how many inventors that we could have had if they were stimulated in school, if they weren't pushed to their fullest extent to actually become their fully realized selves. How many people just burned out and plateaued early because the school system ignored their responsibility to bring out the best in these kids? What have we lost? We'll never know.
That is true.
Yeah.
But one thing that you do is that you run a business.
Mm-hmm.
You run a home improvement, remodeling, and alterations business. So you are integrated into society. You're not isolated.
Yeah.
So in that vein, I mean, in order to support your family, you are out trying to earn a living.
I am.
And I applaud you working with your hands and having a trade. I mean, I think that so many areas now that's becoming a loss. And,
Yeah. So a big part of what I believe in is independence, as you probably have figured out by this point. So being in the trades is certainly a natural extension of that. I want to be empowered to do the things that I need, so I don't need to hire someone. So, for example, my wife's car, because we live in the woods, had a situation where rats destroyed the entire vehicle. Very friendly, cuddly, liberal people decided that it was best to make the insulation out of corn instead of fiberglass, and so the rats thought that smelled tasty. And there's a vent between the main cabin and the exterior that allows for pressure equalization. So when you're going up and down a hill or blasting the air conditioning, you don't open the door and get the bends. So that pressure vent, unfortunately, was basically a rubber doggy door. So the rats went through it no problem. And when I say rats, I do literally mean rats, not mice. So holes this big, chewed in seats, wires shredded completely. I gutted that entire car, and this is a 2015 Subaru. Lots of wires, lots of circuits. I gutted the entire car, replaced all the wires that were chewed, rebuilt all the systems, and when it came to that vent, I welded and Because I have a welder. I welded a steel mesh over it so it could still equalize pressure, but the rats wouldn't be able to come back in. That's the kind of stuff that I want to learn how to do, because can you imagine how much I would have to pay someone to rebuild a modern Subaru? It would be a nightmare. It would be prohibitively expensive. Same thing with building houses. I want to have as many skills as possible, and that's a big part of, when I say my culture, the people that I find political and philosophical affinity with, that's a big part of our culture is the do-it-yourself culture, because we want everyone as much as possible, or as much as they are interested, to be empowered. So when I go to a homeowner's house, not only do I fix their problem, I explain to them what I'm doing, because I want them to hire me because they want to hire me, not because they have to, because I know what it's like to be in the position where I have a problem that's over my head and now I have to shell out my hard-earned money to go do something. I would much rather have a situation where I don't feel like it, here's the money, versus, man, I'm losing out on my medication money so my roof can stop leaking. I want homeowners, if they want to have tools. I'll tell them what tools to get. I'll tell them how to fix things. And I do the same thing with gardening, the same thing with horticulture. Any skill I can, I want to share it. I'm a big believer in open source knowledge, because for me, that creates a world where everyone is more empowered, and maybe corporate oligarchies have less power because they have less dependencies to exploit for profit.
Yeah. Well, and I applaud that. But as you're outlining this, you have to also play by society's rules when you're outside of your own element, your own property. You come to work for me, and you're going to need to secure a building permit. You have to interact with government from time to time. Somebody's going to have to come in and inspect your work, that you are in fact meeting the standards of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, and to be clear,
and that you're hiring, for instance, unless you are a licensed plumber, electrician, you don't need to be licensed to be a carpenter or a painter. You need to be registered to be a contractor.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So we always try to be compliant with the laws when it comes to that sort of stuff, not only because the fines are incredibly persuasive, but also because people make the mistake that I don't believe in rules. I think rules make a lot of sense. I'm not a fan of rulers. And so, subtle distinction, of course, but the way that plays out is building codes make sense. Building codes are about safety. Building codes are about making sure a person's home isn't going to kill them. Certain standards make sense. And so when I violate the law, it's not because it's the law that I just have fun because I'm violating it. It's because it is in the way of me pursuing what I think is morally just or important or valuable in some way. So my relationship with the law is like my relationship with anything else. It's a relationship of nuance. It's saying, does this make sense? For example, framing your house with 16 on-center studs. Why does that make sense? Because it helps the house not collapse. So why am I going to do that? Because I don't want your house to collapse, because I care about you. Or when it comes to a restoration we did recently. There was some improper work done on a house, and a few years later, that caused a situation where almost the entire wall was collapsing due to rot. So that person deviated from the acceptable, conventional, and approved way of building, and in so doing created a terrible situation for someone who didn't deserve it. And so I come in, I fix it, I do it the correct way because we know that that way of doing it works. So yeah, I do conform with society in some ways. I'm not a contrarian. I'm a person who has my own perspectives and will follow them whether or not they conform with the law. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Now, before we came on the air, I inquired whether you read the day paper, and you indicated that you did not.
I don't.
And which is fine. You're not alone. But there's been some interesting articles and series in the last couple of weeks, and I think they dovetail nicely into this conversation. Good. Because one has to do with affordable housing. And I spent a good part of my adult life as a home improvement contractor as well. And I kind of kind of get a kick out of folks who don't understand the trade. When they talk about affordable housing, I mean, where do they expect that this is going to just kind of emanate from? I mean, do you have a cogent response? Maybe you can solve affordable housing.
Well, I don't know that I can solve it.
I mean, unless I'm missing something. I mean, the cost of an 8-foot 2x4 is the same for you as it is for me.
Yeah.
And if we're paying people to work for us, wages are going to be relatively similar.
Yeah.
And whether I'm working on your home or you're working on my home.
Yeah, so the production costs certainly are very high. And a lot of that is because as a home improvement contractor and as an employer who believes strongly in labor rights, my employees are compensated in a living wage. My employees have workman's comp as they're legally required to have. My employees are purchased tools that allow them to do their job appropriately. So there's a certain overhead associated with that. And of course, with regulations, there are certain overhead associated with that as well. Long way of saying, I'm not cheap. And when I work, I do the work the way it's supposed to be done. And I do it for a price that allows me and my workers to have a decent standard of living. So yeah, certainly that has its costs, and that's not accessible to everyone. But the problem of affordable housing, unsurprisingly, of course, is a multidimensional one. You know, you have production, of course, for new buildings being very expensive. You also have factors like rent in existing structures being expensive, and there are additional variables on that. So when I lived in the Bay Area in California, for example, affordable housing was a very serious issue because...
There aren't any.
What's that?
There's not any.
Well, right.
I mean, between scarcity and regulations, and compounds scarcity, it just jacks up prices.
And the other variable we haven't touched on yet is big companies coming in and buying up entire neighborhoods and evicting the entire population on speculation that eventually Google or Facebook will want to buy the property. And so now you see landlords all over the place in that area saying, ooh, I might be able to sell or make money, so I'm going to jack up the rents, and my tenants will either leave and I can sell to the speculator, or I have more money for rent now. And that creates a situation where a difficulty emerges. And so obviously it's not to say that the housing situation in the Bay Area isn't because of a number of factors, obviously. Drugs, substance abuse, all these issues are part of the problem. But when you can come in and buy up an entire neighborhood and kick out everyone in it, that to me is part of the problem. And certainly if those dynamics are allowed to persist, maybe things can happen that are not consistent with what I happen to view as American values. Think about how a company like BlackRock, for example, is one of the biggest holders of property all over the country. What happens if this is allowed to persist to its logical conclusion and eventually all the land, or meaningfully speaking, all of it is owned by various corporations? And slowly the concept of home ownership itself gets eroded. More and more people are renting because less and less spaces are available. And the production costs are so high that now we end up with so many vacant spaces owned by speculators and massive companies that you have people out on the streets and no one can afford to have these places. Last we checked, there are 6 vacant homes for every homeless person in America. That's not my favorite statistic. Or think about out in California. We spoke about this on a previous show, where the California equivalent of the DOT bought up hundreds of homes for a highway expansion, seized it through eminent domain, then abandoned the project, and all the homes were just sitting there vacant, boarded up. This is outside of LA, where there's a housing crisis. And it's not like you're taking these homes from landlords or homeowners. Literally, government-owned buildings sitting there vacant, just rotting. Great example of government waste, right? There's so many dimensions to this problem that there's no one magic bullet solution to things, because there's almost never a magic bullet solution to things. Workers need to be paid properly to do good work. That's important. But we also have waste occurring, and how much waste, fraud, and abuse occurs throughout the system. How much corporate activity is leading down a dangerous path that might undermine everyone's well-being in the future. How much of that is a factor? What balance of those various issues is going to be any given person's focus? That's going to depend on their values. Naturally, one person might say Labor prices are more important than corporate buy-up of land. Some people might say government seizing property and abandoning it is the main variable. But the important thing is with a diverse problem, people united by their care about the problem can come at it from diverse angles, because a diverse problem requires diverse solutions. Not very concise, I'm sorry.
And in all candor, all I've heard you outline here are problems and no solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why I brought the topic up, because I don't necessarily, I think that the folks who rail on this, and politically primarily from the left, they don't understand the problems.
Yeah.
They don't understand business. They don't understand. You need, in order to create affordable housing, you need subsidies. You need somebody else to pay for it. Because if it's purely the market will price it. With your labor and the cost of your 2x4s and your cement blocks, and the lighting and the electrical. I don't know. You're not going to build housing for folks at a discount to be philanthropic, because then you're not providing a living wage, and your suppliers aren't going to supply you with 2x4s for less.
Yeah,
because you're a nice guy, or they want to be a nice guy and provide a house for somebody who may need housing. I mean, they're selling product to make a profit.
Yeah.
And I think people miss the boat. And then when you get involved with subsidized housing, and we also have another article on public housing in the day, where I'd say the track record of its success is not good.
Yeah.
They start out with good ideas and thoughts, and things deteriorate over time, and the quality of the living space deteriorates, and they don't put money back in to maintain and take care of these places, and you create a worse situation than what you're trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the subject of solutions, you'll notice I didn't lay out any solutions, and part of that is because I believe in order to even have a discussion on solutions, you have to acknowledge the full breadth of the problem. Now, obviously some of my solutions may differ from your solutions, and again, I think that's part of what makes this conversation so important. So in situations like that government purchased land out in California, for example, people took it upon themselves to avail themselves of this space, naturally, in blatant violation of the law. But then you have to wonder, well, who is the victim of this situation where the government has bought this place, has abandoned it to rot, and there are people that are in need of homes? They're not stealing homes from people. They're not getting in the way of a project that's happening, because the project was literally abandoned, just like these homes were. To me, I see no problem whatsoever with people availing themselves of these spaces, because it is a truly abandoned space. So that, to me, is an example of people solving the problem themselves. You'll also see people building small spaces for homeless folks outside of mainstream society, again, also outside of the law. And if you've noticed from the day paper from time to time, or my appearances on the radio, that's something I've engaged with as well. I have built micro homes for people hidden in various places around the counties in this area, because that's a way of doing what we call harm reduction. It's not a real solution, and I am under no illusions that it's a real solution, but it's something that creates a slightly less bad outcome until we figure out what's going on. Because you already have people living in tents right now. If you're out in a tent in the winter and a tree branch falls on your tent and rips it, you have the winter in all of a sudden. If you have a situation where your tent gets crushed because of the snow, you could die. You have a situation where if you get a flood, all of your stuff is soaked, all of your documents, all of your belongings. And so with the sober acknowledgement that there are going to be people, especially when COVID was a new thing and everyone was terrified of it, that will not seek official government-sanctioned approaches to resolving their situation. Is it an ethical thing to do to provide them with a safe alternative while the government is figuring out their solution? To me, the answer is yes. Perhaps to you, the answer is no, and you're allowed to have your opinions, as am I. When it comes to building houses for people with materials, I, as part of my business model, do whatever I can to bring more material to people for free whenever I can. So part of what I do is demolitions. And I salvage every bit of usable material I can from that, not only to reduce waste as an environmental thing, but as an understanding that things are expensive. I try to make things affordable wherever I can. I will not concede on the living standard of my workers because I believe dignified work deserves a dignified wage. But when it comes to reducing a cost, I'll absolutely work with you. I have piles of 2x4s at my house that I give to people that are left over, perfectly useful. I have stacks of shingles. I have piles of vinyl windows, and I will give them to you.
Yeah. But, you know,
but that's just me, right? That's not everybody.
Well, and that's very correct. But, you know, the word that you don't hear discussed in polite society, and we'll use New London as an example because there's an awful lot of new construction apartment buildings going up, and they're being promoted as, you know, top of the line luxury apartments.
Yeah.
And they've replaced neighborhoods that were marginal, whether they're recent or going back 20, 30, 50 plus years.
Yeah.
This is known as gentrification.
Certainly is, yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, where are the displaced people going to go?
It's a great question. And, you know, this is that same thing I was talking about when...
And they're not for families.
No, certainly
These
not.
are for single people.
Yeah.
Young couples.
Yeah.
Empty nesters. But
Yeah.
if you've got kids, well, we can't tell you we don't want you, but there's only one bedroom.
Yeah.
Or maybe two.
Yeah. And this is so important. So this is part of my whole motivation for how I approach life. The same thing with growing food, the same thing with teaching skills. The system doesn't care about you. And something like gentrification shows the system doesn't care about you. And what are you going to do with that revelation? Are you going to simply go quietly into the night and be pushed further and further to the margins while all of your historical neighborhoods are destroyed for luxury condos? Maybe you do that. Maybe you decide you want something different. Maybe you decide you're willing to fight for it. Who knows?
Well, I think we've got some dilemmas to deal with here.
Always.
And I always enjoy our conversation. And I appreciate you coming in. You accepted my invitation at Lee's Pinsanity. So that was just a few days ago. And I really appreciate you stepping in to come down tonight. And it's been a lively conversation, as it always is.
Well, you've been very generous with your offer for airtime. I'm always happy to have the opportunity to blab on air.
Well, you know, we agree more often than we disagree, and you know, one of the things that I promote is that, I mean, you're doing it your way, and I do it my way. We should both be able to do it our own way.
Yeah, absolutely.
As opposed to just the way.
Yeah, a one-size-fits-all solution will never work for humanity. We're diverse, and that's a good thing. We shouldn't seek to, you know, homogenize every solution and every problem. A top-down approach will always lead to people at the bottom.
Yeah, well, and that's a frightening thought.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we're going to have to say goodnight. We've exhausted our 50 minutes, and I want to thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much.
And folks, I just reminded myself as the program was going on, we'll have a rerun next week because I'm going to be over at that GOP party over in Groton. So we will see you in 2 weeks live, and we'll be running a rerun of some program next week. And with that, good night.